Me along to hear my presentation this morning. Hope you're all feeling well. The topic for today is the romance of numbers, but before I do that, I'm going to have a chat about how I ended up to be where I am at Macquarie University, and some of you may be able to identify with a bit of my background at least. I was actually born in Annandale in Sydney in I have to say very poor circumstances. The house that I lived in with my parents and sister was 3 metres wide and about 6 metres long. It had one bedroom, and so my sister and I were raised sleeping in the extra room, which wasn't a bedroom, actually a lounge room. And when I was 6 years old, my parents moved to Wentworthville out in the western suburbs, and it was at Wentworthville where I was raised and spent my years until I was 17. I went to Wentworthville Public School, and after Wentworthville Public School, I was lucky enough to get into Parramatta High School. Parramatta High School back in those days was a pretty tough school, and I think it still is a pretty tough school. And at the end of my high school, I finished high school at 16, and really the only subject that I liked at high school was mathematics. I really didn't like history and English and any of that sort of stuff, like some of you perhaps. And so I wanted to do something in mathematics, and so I wanted to go to university, and I had no money to go to university, so I had to go to work instead. So I worked for 3 years as an insurance clerk, that is doing facts and figures for insurance companies. And after 3 years of doing that, I just turned 19, and this new university sprung up in the northern suburbs of Sydney called Macquarie University. And I thought, well, why don't I have a shot at going to Macquarie? And so I did that as a full-time student. This was something that I never thought I'd do, actually get to university. So I went to Macquarie University and actually started off to major in chemistry. And so I did chemistry, mathematics, physics, all of the sciences. And by the end of first year, I decided mathematics was the only thing I really liked to do. So I kept on with mathematics and did a major in mathematics, did an honours degree in mathematics. And then if I wanted to go any further with my mathematics career, the suggestions that I got from the lecturers was that I should go overseas. Now, not having any money and not knowing anybody overseas, I got myself into the University of Minnesota, which is in the Midwest of the USA, a huge university, 65,000 students at the university, of whom 19,000 were international. So not knowing a soul, I went over there, and I actually did a master's degree and a PhD. So I'd come a long way from the days of Annandale, living in that very small house. But even having a PhD and having a higher degree did not guarantee success, because it's still very difficult to find employment. And oddly enough, I did find employment back at Macquarie University, where they offered me a lectureship. So from that point onwards, I stayed at Macquarie, and when I was doing my PhD over in the States, they told all of the boys and girls who were doing their PhD in mathematics, there would be no job for you at the end of it. This was the year of the space program. NASA had sort of stopped flying to the moon, and they estimated there were 10,000 PhDs in mathematics unemployed, trawling across the United States looking for a job. Well, many of us, and including myself, decided to take on a secondary area which was very close to mathematics, and that was the area of statistics. The application of mathematics, if you like, because it soon became clear that if you just did pure mathematics, are you going to be employable? Who's going to employ someone who's really a hot shot at mathematics? And so I did statistics, and I came back to Macquarie, and I was a lecturer in statistics rather than mathematics. And from there, I started to build up statistics programs. And one of the things that I did was start a subject or a course at Macquarie called Gambling, Sport and Medicine. And this was the application of mathematics to sport. And I've since toured the world, also including the Australian Institute of Sport, talking about how mathematics can be applied to develop strategies for a number of sports, for tennis, for football, and so on. Also medicine. Statistics has a great role in medicine and the field of medicine, particularly with clinical trials, trying to determine which drug is effective, which drug is more effective than another one. And for 10 years, I ran a course in medical statistics here at Macquarie for specialists. The application of mathematics is far and wide, and there are many opportunities for people to work in mathematics. People who are really, really good at mathematics, they might want to do actuarial studies. Actuarial studies is offered at Macquarie University, offered at a number of other universities as well, but Macquarie University was the beginning of the whole program, and we've produced many, many hundreds of actuaries who largely work in insurance companies, the field of superannuation, and so on. For 8 years, I was a television presenter. You probably don't know that, but I was on rugby league telecasts with Ray Warren. And you might think, what on earth was I doing on that? And the answer was I was giving forecasts, statistical forecasts of who was going to win the matches. And I did that, as I said, for 8 years. But the travelling got to me after a while. I couldn't keep travelling around the country with all the teams. And so I no longer do that. As we're going to see, I did columns for newspapers where I wrote about statistical facts. And virtually anything that you read in the newspaper that's got a number in it is a statistic. And there's so many opportunities and things that you think you can do with statistics that one of the things I do here, as you know, is I lecture in the Macquarie Graduate School of Management. These are students who are doing a higher degree, a Master's in Business Administration. And one of the things that they want to do is to learn the application of mathematics to the real world. And that's the subject that I teach. It's called Information and Decision Analysis. And these students are quite aggressive, I have to say, that they pay a lot of money to do this subject, and they want something that they can go back to work the next day and actually apply to their job, whether it's forecasting, looking at their stock control, or just simply analysing their data. We offer a whole degree in statistics here at Macquarie, PhDs, master's degrees, where you can become expert in the field. The Australian Bureau of Statistics also employs hundreds and hundreds of statisticians based in Canberra, but also based in every capital city as well. Companies just employ statistical consultants. They have a problem, they want you to solve it. The other area that I mentioned before with the subject we have here, it's actually called gambling, sport and medicine. So as well as looking at medical statistics, we also look at the application of statistics in sport. And we also look at gambling. Now, you're all too young to gamble, I know, but gambling is a very rich field for statistics, looking at strategies, whether it's playing poker machines, roulette. It's more of an education thing, looking at the probability and chance that you will be successful using different strategies. So that's my background, and I'm still at Macquarie, still loving what I do. You might say, well, doesn't it get boring teaching the same thing year after year? And the answer is no, because even though the subject is largely the same, it does change and evolve, the case studies change, and of course the students change. Every term, we have 4 terms a year here. I've got about 105 students this term. There's a fresh intake of students, all with very interesting jobs, and they talk to you about their jobs, they talk to each other and they network, and they learn about the possibilities of mathematics and statistics as they go along. So that's a little bit of my background and why I'm here. And I just want to talk to you a little bit today about some of the things that I've outlined for you. So here we go. The title of this talk is The Romance of Numbers. I'm going to talk to you about how I actually started with a lot of the things that I do, because when you become an academic or a lecturer or a faculty member as they call it, you come along and you're pretty green, you don't know anything, you haven't published anything, and you're put into a big department of experienced people. And I was only in my early 20s when this happened. And I happened to be working for a boss who was a professor, and I wasn't. I was the lowest person you could get. And he was very excited about mathematics and particularly statistics. And so in 1983, which I know sounds a long time ago, but there was a federal election on. And he thought that he would put statistics on the map by forecasting the winner of the federal election. We've just had a recent federal election, as you know, and which Tony Abbott's party won. But back in 1983, it was a very interesting election. And the other thing interesting about it was in 1983, computers were just starting out. People were very suspicious of computers. There'd been mainframe computers around for a long time, but the so-called desktop computer, as we recognize them now, people saw no use for them. There was no internet, there was none of that sort of stuff. It was just, what could a computer do for you? And I have to say that one of the selling points that they made with these computers was that women could put recipes on them and store them rather than having to write them down. And that really seemed to be all that anybody could ever think of back then. A storage of information. The floppy disks were, they had these floppy disks, which you may never have seen, but they were 20 centimetres wide. They were huge things. And so As computers came in the early 1980s and my boss thought that he could predict an election using these computers, Channel 9 actually said to him they would let him do it, and he'd be live on air and he'd be there with his computer trying to forecast the result on election night. So the idea was, using statistical models, that as the votes came in for each particular seat, he would declare that seat won by one party or another. And the idea was that Channel 9 would get this result first because of this computer. And he was called the bearded guru or the bearded professor, and there he was typing away on his computer. As the night went by, things were going pretty good, and Channel 9 was declaring seats all over the place. But there was a problem, and it was a big problem. And the problem was the following. If we look at who was contesting that election back in 1983, one of them, you might recognise that face, that was Bob Hawke for the Labor Party. And he was against the sitting Prime Minister, who was Malcolm Fraser. So nobody knew who was going to win the election. It was going to be a pretty tight race. Malcolm Fraser had been the Prime Minister for about 10 years. What happened was that around about 9 o'clock that night, the computer made a forecast that there was a swing to Fraser of 101%. Now, swings of 2% are big, but swings of 101% are ridiculous. And so at that point of the night, the rest of the channels had declared that Bob Hawke had won the election, but in fact the computer was predicting a clear victory for Malcolm Fraser. It was a terrible night for computers because they got this wrong really badly and became the laughing stock, not just the computers, I have to say, but my boss and also our department. It turned out that Bob Hawke won the election, of course, and went on to become one of our best prime ministers of the time. How did the media see what we did? Well, they took great delight, not just in statisticians falling on their face, but also the fact that computers had also let human beings down. This is some of the things that were in the newspaper the next morning. The Sun Herald had a heading of berserk computers. Berserk meaning it just went crazy, which was true. The Sunday Telegraph said the haywire microchip crystal ball. That's what they called a computer, a crystal ball, because nobody really understood what computers did, was the star of the show, but not for the right reasons. Inspired high comedy, rarely seen on Australian television. This was a complete stuff-up of the highest order. We lost a lot of contracts as a result of that, consulting contracts. And so that was March 1983. Later on that year, with our reputation still in tatters, I said, well, maybe I can do something as a young novice to try and do something in public to resurrect the reputation of statisticians. So I called up the Sun Herald and I said that I'm a bit of a sports fan and I've got a computer here and I can predict the result of the 1983 Rugby League Grand Final. Now, the 1983 Rugby League Grand Final was a very interesting grand final, and I'm sure many of you don't know who was playing in that, but I can tell you. One team was Manly, and they were playing another team. Anybody know what that team was? 1983. I'll tell you. The Parramatta Eels. That's Michael Cronin over there on the right, and that's Crusher Noel Cleal on the left. Now, what was interesting about this match was that 2 weeks before Manly had thrashed Parramatta, and Parramatta had to beat Canterbury to get into the grand final, so Manly were the hot favourites. The Sun Herald said to me, you can really predict the result of the grand final, and I said, yes, I can do that, I have a computer. They'd forgotten all about or didn't know about the disaster we'd had with the election. And they said, can you give us the score? And I said, yes, I can. Statistics can forecast the score, the winning team, and they also wanted reasons why why the winning team was who it was going to be. It would have been easy for me that day to say that Manly was going to win the match because they were the hot favourites. I think they'd beaten Parramatta something like 14-0 2 weeks before. But the one thing that they didn't know with my treasured computer was that I went to Parramatta High School, and I didn't like Manly. And there was no way that I was going to have a computer forecast Manly was going to win the grand final. And so I said that Parramatta was going to win the grand final and they were going to win by 18 points to 14. I was predicting an upset. Well, they paid me $80 to do that, and I spent days writing it up, and they collected it from me. And I thought this will be a little item in the newspaper, and that they'll have in the sports pages. But as I opened the Sunday paper, the Sun Herald, on the day of the grand final, much to my horror, it was a double-page spread, page 4 and 5, of my prediction and who was going to win. Now, I knew that if I got this wrong, this would be really, really bad for us, having got the election wrong, having got this wrong as well. So this is what the newspaper said the next day. This was page 4. It's para by 4 points. And you can see there, it's got grand final computer printout. That was my 18 to 14. I know you can't read the print, but it's talking about computer expert, blah, blah, blah. Well, that was a lot of pressure, and I thought, well, you know, my friends aren't going to read the newspaper because they don't generally read newspapers. And so I thought, well, maybe it'll all blow over. I went to the match the next day, and there were big headlines around the grounds about my forecast of who was going to win this grand final. You want to know what pressure is? That's pressure. So here we go. So that's me back in 1983. There you are, looking pretty much the same as now, don't I? And you can see on the wall there, the top left-hand poster says, Grand Final Special, pick score, and the middle poster, computer picks para win. This was amazing for them. This computer had the power to tip Parramatta, causing the upset. Now, if you want to know why this was 1983 or how you can tell that, well, the first thing is you can see that these days nobody predicts a Parramatta win because they don't really win all that much these days. And the second thing, which you may not be able to see all that well, is on my wrist there, if any of you recognise that, was something that was really cool back in 1983, but not real cool now. It was a calculator watch. It was a watch that did calculations. And that was really novel back in 1983. And when they took this picture, they insisted on having the calculator watch in there with me. So what happened as a result of that? Well, who won the match? Well, it turned out that Parramatta did win the match. Not only did they win the match in an upset, but they also scored 18 points, exactly the number of points that I said. Well, they couldn't believe it, you know, that a computer could do this magic for them. And so they said to me the next day, would you like to do this for every match next season, every week? And I said I'd be more than happy to do that. And so I had a newspaper column in which I did all of these predictions. And at the end of that year, Channel 10 called me up and they said, we're looking for a face of television for rugby league telecasts. Would you like to be the statistical face of that? And I said, yes, I would. I went for a screen test, and there I was. You might say that was a very lucky start. If Manly had won that match, I probably would still be sitting in my office trying to work out where it all went wrong. But it all started out for me that day by getting that match right and getting the score right as well. So that sort of put me on the road to doing some interesting things. I then decided to write a book on statistics, and now I've just finished my 24th book. So writing books is something that I really like to do. So that's a bit of the story of that. And then some years later, I had a reporter came to talk to me about the Sydney Olympics. This was some years later. And they said, do you have any interesting statistics on the Sydney Olympics? If you've got a good memory, you'll know the Sydney Olympics were held in the year 2000. And I said yes, and she happened to mention that she did a weekly column for the Sydney Morning Herald and the Melbourne Age, and I said, and she happened to say that she was leaving the newspapers, and I said, who's going to do your column? And she said, well, I don't know. So being a bit proactive, I called up and I said, I hear there's a vacancy. And they said, how did you hear that? And I said, well, the person who's writing the column now. So I said, I can do a really interesting column on statistics. And they said, you've got to be kidding me. I said, no, very interesting. So I sent them a sample column, and they did find statistics interesting. And I did over 500 columns for them over 12 years. And these were little interesting statistical facts. Along the way, I was also asked by the Mail on Sunday in England to write a column for them, a different one. And that had up to 6 million readers every week. I won't bore you with all the details of the sort of things that I did. The column was called Number Crunch, and it was in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Melbourne Age. But here's an example. What proportion of married men in Australia are going to outlive their wife? This is rather a depressing statistic if you're a man, I have to tell you. Portion of married men who will outlive their wife, 22%. So 80% of the time the wife's going to live longer than the man. I won't go on any more of those, that's probably depressing enough for you, but we'll do something else. I'm going to do something here where you can get to participate, and I want you to use your mathematical skills to work out what I'm doing here. You've probably heard of people called the Mentalists, and you've seen the Mentalist TV show perhaps, and what a mentalist can do is make you believe things that perhaps aren't true. And what I'm going to do is try and get you to collectively all think of the same thing. This is a little mathematical puzzle that I want you to work out. If you need a pen and paper, that's fine. Or if you're really, really good at maths, you can do this in your head. This is what I want you to do. I want you to think of a two-digit number like 64 or 28 or something like that, but you don't tell anybody what that number is. I want you to add the two numbers together. So if you pick 28, you'd add them together and get 10. I want you to take that added together number, say the 10, subtract it from the first number, and then that's your number. So if I had 28, added them together and get 10, take away from 28, I get 18. 18 is my number. So everybody's got to do that. Just think to yourself, a two-digit number, add them together, take it away from your first number. Put your hand up if you've got an answer to that. I can see about 3 people. So you have to do this because it's very important. Think of a yeah, I can see you two doing it. That's great. I want you to think of a two-digit number, add the digits together, take it away from your first number. Now you've got that number in your head, you haven't told anybody, and what I'm going to show you now is a chart. And your number will be on this chart. Everybody's got a different number, and I want you to look at the symbol. If you can you see the chart? I want you to look at the symbol next to your number and keep it in your head. Okay? Look at the symbol next to your number. Now everybody's got a different number, but I'm going to show you in a second. I can make you all think of the same symbol. Here we go. All thinking of that symbol. Who got that symbol? Nobody. Oh, a few people. I can see a whole class there where nobody put their hand up, which means nobody did the problem. Ah, there we are. Somebody at the back is doing that, which I guess means he did it twice. Now, if you didn't do it the first time, yeah, there he goes. Didn't do it the first time, I want you to do it, even if you've done it the first time, I want you to think of a completely different number, add together the two digits, so think of a two-digit number, add together the two digits, take them away from the first number, and then that's your new number. I'm going to show you the same table, and then I'm going to get you to think of the symbol that's next to that this time. Okay, so here's the table again. So you've got a new number now, and I'm going to make you all think it's a different symbol from the first one. I think your symbol is now that one. Who got that symbol? There you go. Ah, a few people. Terrific, thank you. Now you can work out how I did that. Okay, how I got different symbols, getting it to do the problem twice. Who thinks they've worked that out? If you haven't worked it out, ask your teacher and they'll tell you hopefully how I did that. You may have seen these before, but sometimes we have to mark people's work, and you have to decide what mark you're going to give them. So if somebody says, what's 2 and 2, and they say, yes, and they tell you 5, you say, well, is that better than an answer of 6 because it's closer to the right answer? So I'm going to give you an example here of 2 bits of what we would call scholarly work. And if you were marking this person's exam paper, how many marks would you give the person for the answer they gave? So I'm going to show you the question and the answer that the person gave. So you've got to think about the question, look at the answer. Here's the first one. Question said, find x, and the student said, here it is. Now, you might say, well, that's the student being stupid, but in fact, the question's wrong. The question shouldn't have said, find x, the question should have said, find the value of x. And in fact, the student got this answer right, find x. What about this one? The question said, expand the brackets. Well, the student did expand the brackets, but just not in the way that the teacher wanted them to. They just wrote the brackets out wider and wider and wider. The marker put rubbish there, which of course the answer is, but in the student's own mind, expanding the brackets was exactly what they thought the question entailed. I could go on with more of those. So marking is quite a difficult thing for your poor old teacher to do, and has to make a decision whether you get nothing out of 10 or 9 out of 10, even if you get the wrong answer. Now, I don't know how we're going for time here. We're probably almost up. How many? 10. Okay, I'm going to show you something to do with averages. If you don't know who that person is there, that's Sherlock Holmes, the detective. One of the things that when we start to teach statistics is the concept of an average, and I think everybody knows what an average is. You take the average of a few numbers, 2, 3 and 4, you add them up and divide by how many numbers you've got, 2 plus 3 plus 4 over 3. I'm going to talk to you here about a cricket problem. Doesn't matter if you don't understand cricket, but you might recognise who those two people are. And this was a bet that was had between these two cricketers at the end of last year, the end of 2012, beginning of this year's season. That person on the left is, of course, Michael Clarke, and the person on the right is David Warner. And they had a bet, and the bet was the person who had, or the batsman who had the higher batting average at the end of the season would have to pay the other one $500. Okay? The person who had the higher batting average. And so, as you know, cricket is split by the end of the year, then it starts in the new year. So at the end of the 2012 season, halfway through, Michael Clarke had 500 runs scored through 10 innings. His batting average was 50. David Warner had 5 innings, first-class innings for 200 runs. His batting average was 40. So at the end of it, halfway through the season, at the end of 2012, Michael Clarke said to David Warner, I'm beating you. I have a higher average already. And I'm going to beat you in the first half of the next year as well. In the second half of the season, Michael Clarke scored 300 runs in 4 innings at an average of 75. David Warner had 10 innings and scored 700 runs at an average of 70. Michael Clarke won again. So then Michael Clarke says to David Warner, pay up your money. I won in the first half of the season and I won in the second half of the season. I've got the higher batting average. And David Warner says, no, I think I won. How would you think you won when you lost those two? And the answer is David Warner did win. If you were to look at the mathematics or the arithmetic of that, look at David Warner's total runs in his innings and Michael Clarke's total runs, David Warner, in fact, ends up with a higher average than Clarke, even though Clarke has won both of those. That's known in mathematics as Simpson's paradox, and you can have a look at that. Just have a look at this. If you look at the whole season, Michael Clarke scored 800 runs at an average of 57.1, but David Warner's batting average was 60. In fact, it wasn't even close. So David Warner did win the bet quite easily. So that's a bit of a conundrum there, something that you wouldn't have expected to happen, called Simpson's paradox. Remarkable people. I'm going to talk about a fellow here called George Danzig. You wouldn't have heard of George Danzig, but from time to time I have to give graduation addresses. That is, I talk to university graduates, and you have to talk about inspiring people. Here's one such person here called George Danzig. Why was he inspiring? Well, this is one of the things he did. He was born in 1914 in Oregon in the United States. If he was alive today, he'd have his 100th birthday next year. That didn't make him inspiring. He got his bachelor's degree at age 22. That didn't particularly make him inspiring either. And he got married. Well, that inspired George, but perhaps nobody else. He was 23. That's pretty young these days to get married, but not for George and not back in those days. So he married Anne, and so George and Anne Danzig were married in 1937. The next year he got a master's degree in mathematics. None of this is particularly remarkable. George considered himself a fairly good student at mathematics without being an outstanding student at mathematics, and he lived in Oregon with Anne. But he decided that he'd got his master's degree and he was encouraged by other academics or lecturers at his university he should do a PhD. And so he thought that he might give it a go, and so he and Anne went down to the University of California in Berkeley in 1939. and there he enrolled for a PhD. Now, 1939 was the year that the war was breaking out, as you know, the end of 1939. But at the beginning of the year, George enrolled. Now, if you've been reading your history books, you'll know back then there were no PowerPoints, there was no overhead projectors. All they had was a man looking like that, writing on a blackboard. And the man that he had in this particular instance was called Professor Neyman, N-E-Y-M-A-N, a very fierce, ferocious professor. And back in those days, students didn't talk to professors because they were quite revered as very important people. Unfortunately for poor George and his wife lived in a dormitory on the campus, which was a single-room apartment. They had no money, as I said. George was late for his very first lecture to Professor Neyman's class. He didn't know any students, and he came and he sat in the back of the room, a little bit like this room here. One thing he did know about Professor Neyman was that he put the homework problems on the blackboard. So using chalk, Neyman always wrote 2 homework problems on the right-hand side of the board. And sure enough, George came in and he saw the problems there and he copied them down. He didn't speak to anyone, but he went back to his dormitory after the lecture and he said to his wife, Anne, I think I'll try the homework. And he sat down and he said later in life, these were the hardest problems I'd ever seen in my life. And I thought maybe I should drop out of the program because this was only the first day. But he persevered, and in 2 days, he spent 2 full days working on these problems. He said, I think I finally done the assignment, he said to his wife. So then he had to work out what he did with it. So he went and asked another lecturer, where does Professor Neyman like you to put his homework? Now, he wasn't going to ask Neyman because he assumed that Neyman had told people this, and he didn't talk to any students. And the other lecturer said, just put them on his desk, and put your name on it and he'll find it. So George Danzig went into the professor's office. He wasn't there, and he put his homework on the desk right in front of him. George Danzig, homework in his class. And he snuck out of the office. The next day, he had the professor, and the professor didn't mention the homework again. And in fact, George assumed that it was just in the pile of homework being marked. About 5 weeks later, 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning, George and his wife were asleep in bed when there was this tremendous bashing on his door. Somebody was knocking on the door really loudly. So George got up in his pajamas and he went to the door and he opened it, and it was the Professor Neyman, the guy for whom he did the homework. And he said, what do you want? And Neyman said, are you George Danzig? And Danzig could see him waving around his homework. Danzig thought, this is big trouble for me. But he did say, I'm George Danzig. And Neyman said to him, I've prepared everything. I've prepared the papers. And Danzig said, I had no idea what this raving professor was doing at my place at 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning, waving my homework around. Now, if you could think about why was the professor there doing that? And the answer is it had nothing to do with homework. As it turned out, if George hadn't been late that day, he would have known what the professor was talking about, because it wasn't homework at all. What the professor had written on the board were 2 of the world's greatest unsolved mathematics problems. And this kid, thinking they were homework, had copied them down and solved them in 2 days and handed it back in. It was just amazing. And Danzig was asked later in life, had he not been late that day, would he have copied them down and tried them? And he said, don't be stupid. Of course not. Nobody else did. So the moral there is, number 1, don't be late. And number 2 is that he was capable of doing things that he never thought he was capable of. And in fact, he went on to become one of the greatest mathematicians, applied mathematicians of all time. In 1947, he solved another problem at the age of 32, which no one had been able to solve. And the way he solved it is still used today. It's called linear programming. He was awarded in 1975 the highest medal you can get for science, the US National Medal of Science by Gerald Ford. He died in 2005 at the age of 90, and he was survived by that same girl he was with back then, his wife Anne. He'd been married for 68 years. Just to finish up my presentation today, George Danzig's story of doing the homework or thinking it was homework and actually being unsolved problems was so remarkable. That's what he's remembered for today, unfortunately, and not all the other things he did. But they did make a movie that was based on that incident, a boy who was really good at mathematics, but he didn't know how good he was. And this was a movie that was made in 1997 that some of you may have seen. And it wasn't A Beautiful Mind, it was this movie here, Good Will Hunting. Anybody seen Good Will Hunting? Put your hand up. Nobody. There you go. It's a terrific movie. That's Matt Damon on the left, and that's Robin Williams on the right, and Ben Affleck was in it as well. And Matt Damon took the part loosely of George Danzig. Well, that's the end of my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed that. And now, if there's any questions anybody would like to ask, I'm more than happy to answer them. I'm going to give you a clue, okay? So, you think of any two numbers now, we'll do it again. Think of any two numbers now, any two-digit number rather, right? You got that? Add the two digits together and take them away from the first number. So if I said, say, 63, I add them together 9, I take them away and I get 54. If you do the algebra of that, every number that you have is a multiple of 9. For any number you start off with, 78, 7 plus 8 is 15, 78 minus 15, 63, is always a multiple of 9. So what I know is that every number that people get will be either 9, 18, 27, 36, 45, and so on. In my symbol chart, I have the same symbol next to all the multiples of 9. The rest of the chart, nobody will ever get. Your teacher will explain that to you. It's simple algebra.